The cold of the marble floor seeped through the thin soles of her shoes, a constant, chilling reminder of where she was. Isabel gripped the damp cloth in her hand, the smell of lemon and bleach sharp in her nostrils. This was her third day, and the cavernous kitchen of the Moretti mansion still felt like a cathedral built for a god who had long since abandoned it. Gleaming stainless steel, a row of gas burners that could service a restaurant, knives that were likely worth more than her car. All of it sat unused, pristine, collecting a fine layer of dust she was paid to wipe away. She was a cleaner, a maid, an invisible presence in a house suffocated by silence. But she had been a chef first, and the sight of this kitchen, this beautiful, dead heart of the home, was a personal affront. The real insult, however, arrived twice a day on a silver tray. It was carried down by Mrs. Russo, the housekeeper whose face seemed permanently carved from granite. A plate, laden with food prepared by a private chef who came and went like a ghost, would descend from the upper floors untouched. Perfect slice of frittata, cold. A bowl of minestrone, its surface unblemished. A piece of grilled fish, flakes undisturbed. All of it scraped into the bin with a sigh of weary resignation from the housekeeper. The master of the house, Dante Moretti, did not eat. Isabel had only seen him once, a shadow passing the archway of the dining room. He was tall, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. He moved with a heavy stillness, a gravitational pull that commanded space without a word. She had felt his presence before she saw him, a sudden drop in the room's temperature, a tightening in her own chest. That was the man who was starving himself in a palace of plenty. A man who looked at food and, apparently, saw nothing worth wanting. She told herself it was none of her business. She was here to scrub floors and polish silver, to keep her head down and collect the paycheck that would keep a roof over her own head. This job was a lifeline, a desperate grab at stability after her small restaurant had drowned in a sea of debt. She could not afford to be curious. She could not afford to care. However, on the fourth day, the ghost chef did not appear. A frantic, hushed phone call from Mrs. Russo echoed from the pantry. The chef's brother was in the hospital. He would not be coming. Not today, not tomorrow. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle the edges of the housekeeper's composure. The master would need his dinner. An untouched dinner, yes, but the ritual was absolute. The offering had to be made. Isabel stood by the vast island, wiping down the already spotless granite. She could feel Mrs. Russo's anxiety radiating across the room. She could feel the house holding its breath. And in that moment, a reckless, dangerous impulse took hold. It was the chef in her, the part that believed food was not just fuel but a language, a form of care. The part that could not stand the quiet tragedy of those wasted meals. She set down her cloth. The sound was small, but in the oppressive silence, it felt like a gavel strike. Mrs. Russo's head snapped up, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Mrs. Russo," Isabel began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can cook." The housekeeper stared at her, a flicker of disbelief warring with desperation. "You are a maid." "I was a chef," Isabel corrected softly. "For 10 years. I owned my own place." A long, tense silence stretched between them. Isabel could see the calculations turning in the older woman's mind. The risk of letting the new American maid touch the master's food versus the certain catastrophe of presenting him with nothing at all. The house ran on a fragile, unspoken set of rules, and the dinner ritual was paramount. Finally, Mrs. Russo gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "One meal. He will not eat it, but you will prepare it. And if anything is out of place, if he is displeased in any way." She did not need to finish the threat. Isabel understood perfectly. Displeasure in this house was not a matter of a bad review. It was a matter of dismissal. Or worse, she was stepping out of the shadows, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that once she was seen by the master of this house, she might never be invisible again. The choice was made. She had just traded her safety for a chance to speak the only language she had left. The kitchen, once a cold monument, was now her domain. Isabel tied her hair back, the gesture familiar and centering. She washed her hands, the water scalding hot, stripping away the scent of cleaning chemicals and leaving her ready. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of her old self return. The woman who could command a brigade of line cooks and turn simple ingredients into something sublime. Mrs. Russo watched her from the doorway, a hawk observing a sparrow, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The pressure was immense, a physical weight in the air. Isabel ignored her. She opened the walk-in refrigerator, a cavern of culinary possibility. It was stocked with the finest ingredients money could buy. Cheeses from Parma, tomatoes from San Marzano, olive oil that was greener than emeralds. But there was no love in it. It was a collection, not a pantry. She saw a beautiful cut of beef, short ribs marbled with fat that promised to melt into lusciousness. She saw root vegetables, humble and earthy. An idea took shape, a memory of a dish she used to make on the coldest winter nights at her restaurant. A dish that never failed to sell out. Braised short ribs with a creamy polenta. It was comfort. It was soul. It was everything this house lacked. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity. The rhythmic chop of her knife on the cutting board was the only sound. Searing the ribs until they were deeply browned, the Maillard reaction releasing a scent of rich, roasted meat that began to fill the sterile air. Sautéing the mirepoix, the holy trinity of onion, carrot, and celery, their sweetness softening in hot oil. Deglazing the pan with a splash of deep red wine, the hiss and steam a form of alchemy. She added beef stock, a bundle of fresh herbs, and then nested the ribs back into the liquid, covering the heavy Dutch oven and sliding it into the oven for a long, slow braise. The scent began to permeate the ground floor. It was a smell of home, of patience, of something deeply good. It curled out of the kitchen, down the hallways, a stark contrast to the house's usual scent of old stone and expensive, lifeless floral arrangements. Isabel saw a young man in a dark suit, one of the guards she sometimes glimpsed, pause in the hallway, his head tilted, his expression softening for a bare moment before he caught himself and moved on. Food was a current and she had just switched it on. While the ribs braised, she prepared the polenta. She did it the old way, standing over the pot, whisking constantly, adding warm milk and a knob of butter, then folding in a generous handful of freshly grated Parmesan. It became a silken, golden pool, the very essence of comfort. When the ribs were done, the meat was so tender it fell away from the bone with the gentle nudge of a fork. The sauce was a dark, glossy reduction, complex and profound. She plated it carefully. A bed of the creamy polenta, 2 perfect short ribs laid over top, a ladle of the rich sauce spooned over everything, and a final flourish of chopped parsley for freshness. It was simple. It was honest. It was a prayer on a plate. Mrs. Russo appeared at her elbow, her face unreadable. She inspected the dish, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. She placed the plate on the silver tray, along with a linen napkin and heavy, ornate silverware. Without a word, she turned and carried it up the grand staircase. The silence that descended on the kitchen was heavier than before. Isabel was left with the aftermath of her creation. The dirty pots, the lingering, beautiful smell, and the thudding of her own heart. She had done it. She had cooked in Dante Moretti's kitchen. Now all she could do was wait for the verdict. She began to clean, her movements automatic, her mind replaying every step. Was the seasoning right? Was the polenta too rich? Was it a mistake to cook something so rustic, so personal? An hour passed, then another. She had finished cleaning the entire kitchen, and still nothing. The silence from upstairs was absolute. She began to feel a cold dread creep into her stomach. Perhaps it was worse than him not eating it. Perhaps he was offended. Perhaps she had crossed a line so severe that there was no coming back. The door to the kitchen swung open. Isabel's head shot up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was not Mrs. Russo. It was him. Dante Moretti stood in the doorway, filling it completely. In person, he was larger, more imposing than the shadow she had glimpsed. His black suit was immaculate, the shoulders sharp, the fit bespoke. His dark hair was cut short, severe. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his jaw tight. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of the darkest espresso, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He held a plate in his hand. Her plate. It was not just empty. It was wiped clean, the last vestiges of the sauce smeared away with what must have been a piece of bread. He did not thank her. He did not smile. He simply walked to the central island and set the plate down. The ceramic made a soft clink against the granite, a sound that echoed in the vast room like a gunshot. He looked at her, his gaze direct, analytical, as if he were trying to deconstruct her, to understand how she had done it, how she had breached a defense no one else could. Isabel stood frozen, her hands suddenly clammy. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only stare back into the abyss of his eyes and wait. He was a predator, and she was a small, foolish creature that had just wandered into his hunting ground. He tilted his head slightly, a subtle, assessing movement. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her, the first time he had acknowledged her existence. "Tomorrow," he said, the word clipped, precise. "You will cook for me again." And then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the scented silence. The clean plate a testament to the fact that her world had just irrevocably, terrifyingly, changed. She had wanted to be invisible. But Dante Moretti saw her now. She was no longer just the maid. She was the woman who had made him eat, and in his world, that made her something far more dangerous. It made her a curiosity, and she had a sickening feeling that he was a man who dissected everything that caught his interest. The next day, a new routine began. Isabel was no longer handed a bucket and rags. Mrs. Russo, her expression a mixture of awe and deep suspicion, informed her that her duties had changed. She was now officially Mr. Moretti's cook. The ghost chef was not mentioned again. It was as if he had never existed. Isabel was given a small, plain uniform, a simple black dress and white apron, a stark contrast to the casual clothes she had worn for cleaning. It felt like a costume, marking her new role in this silent play. Her life was now confined to the kitchen and the small, sparse servants' room she occupied on the ground floor. She would rise before dawn, plan the day's meals, and cook. Breakfast, which he still did not eat, but for which she prepared a tray of fruit and a single, perfect pastry, just in case. Lunch, which he took in his study. And dinner, the main event, the performance she was judged on every single night. Dante Moretti remained a mystery. He never spoke to her about the food. The only feedback she received was the empty plate, returned every single time. She began to cook with a desperate creativity, trying to understand the man through his palate. He ate everything she made. A simple roast chicken with lemon and rosemary. A complex lasagna with a bechamel she spent an hour perfecting. A light, brothy fish stew. Nothing was ever left. Yet he remained a ghost. She would hear his heavy footsteps in the hall, catch a glimpse of his broad back as he disappeared into his study, feel the weight of his presence in the house. She learned about him in whispers from the other staff, the two young guards who stood by the doors, the quiet woman who did the laundry. They spoke of him with a mixture of fear and reverence. They called him the Don. They spoke of his temper, which was said to be a cold, lethal thing, not hot and explosive. They spoke of business, of territories, of respect. And they spoke of his brother, Marco. Marco Moretti had been killed 2 years ago. Betrayal from within the family, the whispers said. A car bomb meant for Dante had taken his older brother instead. They said Dante had not been the same since. He had been colder, harder, more silent. And Isabel pieced together that was when he had stopped eating. The joy had been surgically removed from his life, and food was just one of its casualties. This knowledge changed how she cooked. She was no longer just feeding a man. She was trying to reach a ghost. She began to pour her own emotions into the food, a silent conversation on a plate. She cooked with empathy, with a quiet sorrow for the man she did not know but whose grief seemed to stain the very walls of the house. One rainy Tuesday, she felt a strange pull, an instinct she could not name. She found a bag of dried cannellini beans in the pantry, fennel sausage in the fridge, a sprig of rosemary that was starting to wilt. An image surfaced in her mind, a memory of a soup her Italian-American grandmother used to make. A rustic, humble soup, thick with beans and savory sausage, fragrant with garlic and herbs. Zuppa Toscana. It was a risk. It was peasant food, not the fine dining fare the previous chef had likely prepared. It was a dish from the heart, not from a cookbook. She spent the afternoon on it, letting the soup simmer for hours, the flavors melding, deepening, becoming something more than the sum of their parts. The scent that filled the kitchen was different this time. It wasn't just the smell of good food. It was the smell of memory, of warmth against a cold day, of a grandmother's love in a bowl. She sent it up with a piece of crusty, grilled bread rubbed with garlic. Then she waited. The hours ticked by. The rain lashed against the tall kitchen windows. She had cleaned everything, put the kitchen to bed, and was about to retreat to her own room when the door opened. It was him again, but he was different. The severe control he always wore like a second skin was gone. His tie was loosened, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. His face was pale, and his eyes were red-rimmed, raw. He looked as though he had been weeping. The sight was so shocking, so completely at odds with the formidable man she knew, that she froze, a dish towel clutched in her hand. He did not speak. He walked into the kitchen, his movements slow, almost hesitant. He stopped at the counter where she had been working. A single, stray needle of rosemary lay on the white marble. He reached out, his long fingers surprisingly gentle, and picked it up. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, his gaze distant, lost. He brought it to his nose and inhaled deeply. Isabel's heart ached. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she had done more than just feed him. She had unlocked something. That humble soup had been a key, and it had opened a door to a room inside him filled with a pain so profound it had brought the formidable Dante Moretti to his knees. He stood there for a full minute, lost in the scent of a simple herb, and she stood watching him, the silence in the room no longer empty, but filled with the weight of his unspoken grief. The gulf between the maid and the master had, for a moment, vanished. They were just a man and a woman in a quiet kitchen, bound by the strange, powerful intimacy of a shared memory he didn't even know she had given him. The fragile moment in the kitchen shattered as quickly as it had formed. Dante straightened up, the mask of cold control sliding back into place. He dropped the rosemary sprig onto the counter, the small green needle looking stark and alone on the white marble. He gave her one last, unreadable look before turning and leaving without a word. But something had fundamentally shifted between them. He had allowed her to see a crack in his armor, and now they both knew it was there. His reliance on her food became more pronounced. He began to have his dinner served in the small, informal dining room adjacent to the kitchen, rather than the cavernous hall upstairs. Sometimes, he would instruct Mrs. Russo that Isabel was to bring the tray in herself. These were torturous moments. She would enter the room, her heart pounding, and set the plate before him. He would not look at her, his attention fixed on the papers spread across the table. But she felt his awareness of her, a tangible force in the room. He was observing her, studying her, and she did not know what he was looking for. One evening the house was on edge. A palpable tension hummed through the walls. The guards were more alert, their gazes sharper. Mrs. Russo was even more tight-lipped than usual. Isabel heard snippets of a phone call Dante took in his study, his voice a low, lethal snarl. Words like Falcone and territory and disrespect cut through the air. The danger of his world, usually an abstract concept, was beginning to feel terrifyingly real. He came home very late that night, long after the household was meant to be asleep. Isabel heard the heavy front door open and close. She had been in the kitchen, unable to settle, nursing a cup of tea. She saw him walk past the doorway, and her breath caught. His suit jacket was gone, His white shirt was rumpled and stained with something dark near the cuff, and there was a fresh, angry red cut high on his cheekbone. His knuckles were bruised. He stopped, turning his head as if he sensed her presence. He looked at her, and for a second, she saw a flicker of raw exhaustion in his eyes before it was extinguished. "Café," he ordered, his voice rough. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She moved to the espresso machine, her hands trembling slightly as she measured the grounds. She was acutely aware of him leaning against the doorframe, watching her every move. The air was thick with the scent of him, a mixture of expensive cologne, cold night air, and something else, something metallic and sharp. Blood. She placed the small, steaming cup and a saucer on the counter. He pushed off the doorframe and walked towards her. He did not take the coffee. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not to take the cup, but to touch the side of her neck, his thumb brushing against her pulse point. His touch was shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to his bruised knuckles. "You are not afraid," he stated. It was not a question. Isabel met his gaze. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she held his stare. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. This man, this house was her survival. But in that moment it was more than that. She saw the weariness in him, the immense weight he carried, and she felt a strange, protective instinct rise within her. She could have run when she saw the blood. She could have packed her single bag and disappeared into the night. But she did not. "Should I be?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. He let his hand drop. He picked up the coffee, drank the espresso in one quick swallow, and set the cup down with a decisive click. "Go to bed, Isabel," he said, and for the first time he used her name. It sounded different in his mouth. Possessive. Final. That night marked a turning point. She had seen the violence of his life written on his body, and she had not flinched. She had stayed. And in doing so, she had made a choice without even realizing it. She had chosen to remain in the orbit of this dangerous, broken man. Her decision was not born of logic, but of a deeper, more primal connection forged in the quiet intimacy of his grief and her food. She was no longer just his cook. She was becoming his anchor in a world determined to drown him. And that made her the most vulnerable person in the entire house. The war with the Falcone family escalated. It was a cold war, fought in the shadows of the city, but its chill reached all the way into the sanctuary of the Moretti mansion. Dante grew more distant, more consumed. The rare moments of quiet vulnerability vanished, replaced by a constant, simmering vigilance. He was a king defending his castle, and the strain was beginning to show. He lost weight, the angles of his face becoming sharper, the shadows under his eyes darker. But he always ate her food. It seemed to be the only thing that tethered him to the world. Isabel felt the danger like a change in atmospheric pressure. One afternoon, Mrs. Russo sent her on an errand. A specific type of wild mushroom was needed for the risotto Dante had, in a rare moment of direct communication, requested. It felt strange to leave the gilded cage of the mansion. The city felt loud, chaotic, and hostile. As she was leaving the specialty market in Little Italy, she noticed it. A black sedan, parked across the street with two men inside. They were not looking at the shop. They were looking at her. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She told herself she was being paranoid. But as she started walking, the car pulled out and began to follow her, keeping a steady distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was not a coincidence. They knew who she was. She was the Don's cook, a piece on the chessboard, a vulnerability. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but the same instinct for survival that had guided her in her failed restaurant kicked in. She was not prey. She thought quickly. She ducked into the crowded entrance of a subway station, bought a ticket, and pushed through the turnstile. She waited on the packed platform, the black sedan now useless. She watched the train approach, and just as the doors were about to slide shut, she jumped on, losing herself in the crush of bodies. She rode it 2 stops, got off, and immediately boarded a train going in the opposite direction. An hour later, after a dizzying series of transfers and a walk through a neighborhood she was sure they wouldn't expect, she finally hailed a cab back to the mansion. She walked into the kitchen, her bag of mushrooms clutched in her hand, her legs shaking. Dante was there, standing by the window, looking out into the dusk. He turned as she entered. He did not have to ask. He saw it on her face. "They followed you," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She just nodded, unable to find her voice. He walked toward her, his expression grim. He took the bag from her nerveless fingers and set it on the counter. His gaze swept over her, a quick, efficient check for any harm. "You did well," he said. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment. "You are resourceful." He turned away from her and spoke into the small communication device on his wrist. His voice was low, but the words were lethal. "Find the car. Find the men. I want their names. I want to know who gave the order." He was angry. No, it was more than anger. It was a cold, contained rage that was terrifying in its stillness. And it was on her behalf. The realization sent a strange, unwanted warmth through her. He was protecting her. But she was only in danger because of him. The paradox was a cage she was building around herself, bar by golden bar. She was no longer just an employee. She was part of his world now, and the price of admission was her safety. A few nights later, the war came home. Isabel was in the kitchen, prepping for dinner, when 2 of Dante's men dragged another man through the back entrance. The man was bleeding from a cut on his head, his face a mask of terror. He was one of their own, a soldier she recognized from the periphery. His name was Leo. He had been caught talking to a Falcone capo. He was a traitor. They hauled him past her, his feet scuffling on the tile floor. As he passed, his desperate eyes locked on hers. "Please," he whimpered, a raw, animal sound of pure fear. "Help me, tell him." But then one of the guards shoved him forward, and he was gone, dragged down the hallway toward the basement. The plea hung in the air, a stain on the clean, quiet kitchen. Isabel stood frozen, the knife in her hand suddenly heavy. She knew what happened to traitors. She had seen it in movies, read it in books. But this was real. The smell of Leo's fear was real. The sound of the basement door closing with a heavy thud was real. She felt sick. This was the brutal truth of Dante's world, the foundation upon which his power was built. An hour later, Dante appeared in the kitchen doorway. His hands were clean, his suit jacket uncreased. But his face was a stone mask. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Leo was brought through here," he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it held the weight of an interrogation. "Did he speak to you?" Here it was. A choice. A line. She could tell him the truth. That the man had begged for his life, had begged her for help. It would change nothing for Leo. His fate was already sealed. But it would confirm her position as an outsider, a civilian who heard things she shouldn't, where she could lie. She could offer him the gift of her silence, a silence that mirrored his own, a silence that said, "I am part of this world. I see nothing." She met his gaze directly, her own expression as blank as she could make it. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. He said nothing. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, a foreign object. She had just protected Dante not from a threat, but from the messy, pleading humanity of his own brutal justice. She had crossed a moral line she never thought she would approach. Dante watched her for a long, silent moment. He knew she was lying. She was a terrible liar, but he accepted it. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. He had tested her, and she had chosen a side. Her side. That night, he had her serve dinner in the formal dining room. The long, polished table stretched between them like a dark river. He ate the ossobuco she had made, the meat falling off the bone, the saffron risotto of vibrant gold. The silence was profound. When he was finished, he pushed his plate away and looked at her, his expression intense. "The soup," he said, his voice low and rough. "The one you made last week." Isabel's heart stuttered. "My mother," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "She used to make it, for Marco and me. She made it the night before he stopped, his jaw tightening. He did not need to finish the sentence. The grief was a living thing in the room, a third presence at the table. No one has made it since. He had given her the key, the source of his pain, the reason for his starvation. It was not a declaration of love, not an admission of feeling. It was something far more intimate, far more dangerous. It was a confession. He had handed her the broken pieces of his heart, not for her to fix, but for her to see. And in that moment, she knew she was lost. She had lied for him. She had accepted the violence of his world. And he had trusted her with the one wound he let no one else touch. There was no going back. Her lie, the one she had told to shield Dante from the pathetic desperation of a dying man, had immediate and unforeseen consequences. Leo, the traitor, had been holding back one final piece of information, a bargaining chip he never got to play. He knew the specifics of the Falcone's next move. Not an attack on a warehouse or a shipment, but a direct assault on the mansion itself. A decapitation strike aimed at Dante. Because Isabel had feigned ignorance, Dante's questions had stopped, and that final, crucial detail had died with Leo in the basement. The attack came on a Saturday night. It was sudden, brutal, and perfectly coordinated. The quiet of the evening was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire from the perimeter, followed by the explosion of the main gate. The house, which had always felt like a fortress, was breached. Alarms blared, a jarring electronic scream that echoed through the halls. Isabel was in the kitchen, just finishing the cleanup from dinner, when the first sounds of chaos erupted. Her first instinct was to drop, to hide. She scrambled behind the massive stainless steel island, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She could hear shouting in the hallways, the heavy thud of bodies, the sharp crack of gunshots now inside the house. This was not a distant war anymore. It was in her home, in her kitchen. The swinging door from the dining hall burst open. It was not one of Dante's men. The man who stood there was dressed in black tactical gear, a ski mask covering his face, a pistol held ready in his hands. His eyes, cold and focused, swept the room and landed on her cowering form. He saw an easy target, a servant, a witness to be eliminated. He raised his weapon. Time seemed to slow down. In that split second, Isabel saw the boiling pot of water she had just set on the stove for her nightly tea. She saw the heavy, cast-iron skillet she had used for dinner, sitting on the counter to cool. Her terror was a white-hot fire, but something else rose with it. A primal, furious refusal to be a victim. She did not scream. She acted. As the man took a step toward her, she lunged not away from him, but toward the stove. She grabbed the handle of the pot, her hand screaming in protest at the heat, and she threw the boiling water directly at his face. He roared in agony, dropping his gun to claw at his mask, at his burning skin. The momentary advantage was all she needed. She snatched the heavy skillet from the counter. It was perfectly weighted, a familiar tool in her hand. She swung it with all her strength, all her fear, all her rage, and connected with the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound, a heap of black gear and sudden, shocking stillness. Isabel stood over him, panting, the skillet still held aloft. Her entire body trembled, but she was alive. She had fought back. The kitchen door burst open again. This time it was Dante. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his own gun in his hand, his face a mask of lethal fury. He took in the scene in an instant. The downed Falcone soldier, the smell of scalded flesh, and her, standing there, fierce and terrified and unbroken. His eyes locked on hers, and in them, she saw a flicker of stunned, raw admiration. She had not waited to be rescued. "Isabel," he rasped, his voice tight, He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her arm. His touch was firm, grounding. "We have to move. Now." He pulled her behind him, keeping his body between her and the open doorway. The sounds of the firefight were closer now. He began to move them through the service corridors, his movements economical and precise. He was a creature of this violence, moving through it like it was his natural element. He would push her behind a pillar, fire 2 precise shots down a hallway, and then pull her along again, his hand never leaving her arm. The grip was not painful. It was possessive. It was a promise. In the heart of the chaos, pressed against his back, the scent of gunpowder and his cologne filling her senses, she felt a terrifying sense of belonging. This was his world, and he was pulling her into its very center. The battle for the house was short and bloody. Dante's men, though taken by surprise, were loyal and well-trained. They pushed the Falcone attackers back, turning the mansion's opulent hallways into a kill zone. The assault was repelled, but the cost was etched into the walls in the form of bullet holes and shattered art. The silence that fell in the aftermath was heavier than any that had come before, thick with the smell of cordite and death. Dante led Isabel not to her small room, but up the grand staircase, through the carnage, to his private suite. He pushed the door open and guided her inside. It was a vast, masculine space, all dark woods and clean lines, dominated by a massive bed and a wall of windows overlooking the wounded gardens. He closed the door behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place a note of finality. He finally let go of her arm. He stood before her, his suit jacket gone, his shirt torn at the sleeve. He looked at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, checking for injuries he might have missed. "They came for me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But they found you. They thought you were a weakness. A way to get to me." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, consuming all the available air. "That will never happen again." He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb stroking the curve of her jaw. The gesture was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence of the past hour. "You are not a maid, Isabel. You are not my cook." His gaze was intense, possessive, a fire burning in the dark depths. "You are mine, mine to protect. Do you understand?" It was not a question expecting an answer. It was a declaration, a claim. In his world, protection was ownership. He was claiming her as he would claim territory, as he would claim a life owed to him. Most women would have been terrified. Most women would have run. Isabel looked into his eyes, and she saw everything there. The lonely man who could not eat, the grieving brother, the ruthless Don, the man who had seen her fight back in his kitchen and had looked at her not with pity, but with respect. She saw the gilded cage he was offering her, and she knew that if she stepped inside, the door would lock forever. She could leave. She could demand to be taken away, to disappear back into her old life. But she thought of the empty plates. She thought of the way he had said her name. She thought of the boiling water and the iron skillet, and the strange, fierce pride she had felt in that moment of survival. Her old life was gone. It had burned down the day she took this job. This was her life now. She did not answer him with words. She simply leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. It was her surrender. It was her choice. A muscle in his jaw clenched. He had expected fear or tears or demands. He had not expected acceptance. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. They stood like that for a long time, 2 survivors in the quiet heart of the storm, the war outside over, the war inside just beginning. Later, in the gray light of dawn, they went downstairs. The house was a wreck. His men moved silently, cleaning up the evidence of the fight. Isabel walked into her kitchen. It was a disaster zone. Broken glass crunched underfoot. The body of the Falcone soldier was gone, but a dark stain marred the pristine tile. Her pots and pans were scattered. She looked at the chaos, at the heart of her small kingdom, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Dante stood in the doorway watching her. She bent down and picked up a piece of a shattered plate. Then she saw the broom, leaning against the wall where a guard had left it. Without thinking, she picked it up and began to sweep the broken glass into a small pile. It was a simple, mundane act in the face of such overwhelming violence. An attempt to restore a tiny piece of order. "The kitchen is a mess," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I can't cook in this." Dante watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed the room and gently took the broom from her hands, setting it aside. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. His grip was warm, solid. "I will have it cleaned," he said. It was a promise. He did not let go of her hand. He stood with her in the center of the wrecked kitchen, the rising sun casting long shadows across the floor. He did not smile. He did not offer words of love or comfort. He did not need to. In his world, actions were the only truths that mattered. And by standing with her, by holding her hand amidst the ruins of their shared home, he was saying everything. She was no longer just the woman who fed him. She was the woman who had fought beside him. She had seen the monster and she had not run. She had stayed. And in the silent, brutal world of Dante Moretti, that was the only kind of love that could ever truly exist.